The diplomatic station floated in the empty space between two empires. They called it Horizon's Edge, a place where enemies could speak without weapons. On one side was humanity, young and hungry, spreading across the stars like fire. On the other side was the Kirith Empire, ancient and proud, rulers of 100 frozen worlds. Sergeant Hante stood near the wall of the banquet hall, watching everything and saying nothing. He wore his powered X-armor, the black metal covering him from neck to toe. The armor made him look bigger, stronger, almost like a machine himself. That was the point. Humans were smaller than most species in the galaxy. The armor helped them forget that Tay was 34 years old. He had fought in 3 wars across different star systems. He had buried friends on planets whose names he could barely pronounce. His face was calm, almost bored, but his eyes never stopped moving. He watched the aliens. He watched his own people. He watched the doors. Private Kim Yuna stood beside him. She was young, maybe 23, with the red cross of a medic on her shoulder. She was nervous. This was her first diplomatic mission. "They keep staring at us," she whispered. "Let them stare," Tay replied. The Kirith were tall and pale with skin like fresh snow. They had evolved on ice worlds, where temperatures could kill a human in minutes. Their bodies were perfect for the cold. They moved slowly, gracefully, like they had all the time in the universe. And maybe they did. Their empire was 10,000 years old. Humanity had only been in space for 2 centuries. The banquet was supposed to build trust between the two species. Instead, it felt like a contest. The Kirith looked at the humans the way a wolf looks at a rabbit. Then she walked in. Princess Vela was 19 years old, the only daughter of Emperor Doran. She was beautiful in a strange, alien way. Her skin was pale blue, and her eyes were silver, like frozen moons. She wore a gown made of something that looked like liquid starlight. Every Kirith in the room bowed when she entered. The humans just watched. Vela walked through the crowd like she owned every person in it. Maybe she did. Her father controlled an empire that could destroy Earth in a single day. She had never known fear. She had never known failure. She had been told since birth that the Kirith were the greatest species in the galaxy. She believed it completely. Her eyes found the human soldiers standing by the wall. She smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Look at them," she said to her attendants, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The famous humans, the species that conquered a dozen worlds in a single century." She walked closer, her silver eyes fixed on Tay. "Tell me, soldier, how did your kind do it? How did such soft, weak creatures spread so far, so fast?" Tay said nothing. His face remained calm. Villa laughed. "Ah, I see. You do not speak. You just stand there in your metal shell, pretending to be strong." She reached out and tapped his chest plate with one long finger. The sound echoed in the silent room. "Without this armor, what are you? A hairless animal that cannot survive a cold night? A creature so fragile that a simple fall could break your bones?" The human diplomats looked uncomfortable. One of them stepped forward. "Your Highness, perhaps we should return to the negotiations." "Quiet," Vela said. She did not look away from Tay. "I am speaking to the soldier." Yuna felt her hand shaking. She wanted to say something, to defend her sergeant, but she was too scared. The princess could have them all killed with a single word. Vela walked a slow circle around Tay, examining him like he was an animal in a cage. "My people have a tradition," she said. "The frozen path. It is a test of strength and will. A warrior must walk 200 kilometers across the glaciers of our home world with no help and no shelter. The cold can reach 90 degrees below zero. The ice storms can freeze blood in seconds. Even our strongest warriors sometimes die on the path." She stopped in front of Tay, her face close to his helmet. "I wonder, human, could you survive such a test? Without your precious armor? Without your machines and your technology?" The room was silent. Every eye was on them. "No," Vela answered her own question. "Of course you could not. Because without your shells, you are nothing. Your species is nothing. You hide behind metal and call it strength. But true strength comes from within. True strength is in the blood, in the bones, and you do not have it. She turned to walk away, satisfied with her insult. Except, the words were quiet, but they stopped the princess in her tracks. She turned slowly, her silver eyes wide. Tay reached up and unclasped his helmet. He pulled it off, revealing his face for the first time. It was an ordinary face, neither handsome nor ugly. Korean features, dark eyes, short black hair, starting to show gray at the temples. A small scar above his left eyebrow. "I accept your challenge," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I will walk your frozen path. No armor. No machines. Just me." Vila stared at him. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the first small seed of doubt. Then she laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "You will die," she said. "You understand this? You will freeze to death before you complete the first day." Tay put his helmet under his arm. "Maybe," he said, "but I will walk." The Kirith in the room began to whisper among themselves. This was unprecedented. No alien had ever attempted the frozen path. No alien would be foolish enough to try. Yuna grabbed Tay's arm. "Sergeant, you cannot do this. It is suicide. Our bodies are not made for that kind of cold. Please, think about what you are doing." Tay looked at her, and for just a moment she saw something in his eyes. Not fear. Something older and deeper. The look of a man who had already made peace with death a long time ago. "Private," he said. "My grandmother survived the winter of 2087. When the heating systems failed in half of Korea, she walked 30 kilometers through the snow to find help. With nothing but a coat and her own 2 feet. She was 63 years old." He looked back at the princess. "My people have been walking through cold places since before we had fire. This is nothing new." Vila's smile faded. She did not understand what she was seeing. This human should be begging for mercy. He should be making excuses. He should be afraid, but he was not afraid. He was just a man standing in a room full of enemies, and he was not afraid. "Very well," she said finally. "Tomorrow, you will come to Kirith Prime, and tomorrow, you will learn what true cold means." She turned and walked out of the banquet hall. Her attendants followed, whispering frantically. Tay put his helmet back on and returned to his position by the wall. Yuna stared at him. "Sergeant, why? Why would you do this?" He did not answer for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Because someone needs to show them who we really are." Outside the station windows, the stars burned cold and bright. Somewhere among them, a frozen world was waiting. The ship carrying the human delegation arrived at Kirith Prime the next morning. Through the viewport, Tay watched the planet grow larger. It was beautiful in a terrible way. The entire world was white and blue, covered in ice that had been there for millions of years. There were no green forests, no blue oceans, no signs of the warmth that humans called home. Just endless frozen wilderness under a pale sun. The news of the challenge had spread faster than anyone expected. What began as a princess's insult had become an official event. Emperor Doran himself had declared it a trial of endurance. The whole empire was watching. Millions of Kirith across 100 worlds had tuned in to see a human die. The terms were simple. If Tay survived the frozen path, humanity would be granted full trading rights with the Kirith Empire. The treaty would be signed, and both species would move forward as equals. But if he died, everyone expected him to die. The human delegation would leave Kirith space forever. All negotiations would end. The relationship between the two species would be finished. Yuna had not slept. She sat in the small medical bay of the ship, going through her supplies again and again. Burn treatments for frostbite. Warming packs. Emergency injections that could restart a frozen heart. She knew none of it would help. Once Tay was on that ice, she would not be allowed to touch him. Those were the rules. He would walk alone, or he would die alone. She found him in the cargo hold, sitting on the floor with his eyes closed. He had removed his armor completely. He wore only the standard thermal fatigues that human soldiers use for cold environments. A thin jacket, pants, and boots. Nothing else. No helmet. No gloves. Nothing that could be called advanced technology. "That is what you are wearing?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. Tay opened his eyes. "This is what I am allowed to wear." The Kirith were very specific. No powered equipment. No heating elements. Nothing that they consider artificial. Yuna sat down across from him. "Sergeant, I have studied the medical data. The temperatures on that planet can reach 90 degrees below zero. The wind can make it feel even colder. A human body will begin to shut down within hours of exposure. Your blood will thicken. Your heart will struggle. Your brain will stop working properly. You will become confused. You will fall asleep. And you will not wake up." Tay listened calmly. "I know then why." Tears were forming in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? It is not worth your life. No treaty is worth this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what the Kirith call us? They call us shell wearers. Parasites who survive only because of our machines. They think we are weak. They think we are nothing without our technology." He looked at his bare hands. "Maybe they are right. Maybe we have become too dependent on our tools. But that is not who we were. That is not who we are." He stood up and walked to the small viewport. The frozen planet filled the entire view now. "My people crossed ice ages with nothing but animal skins and fire," he said. "We walked across frozen land bridges to find new homes. We climbed the highest mountains on Earth, where the air is thin and the cold can kill in minutes. We did these things before we had medicine, before we had science, before we had any of the things that make life easy." He turned back to face her. "The Kira think they are special because they evolved for the cold. But we did not evolve for anything. We are not built for cold. We are not built for heat. We are not built for any environment at all. And yet we survive everywhere. Do you know why?" Yuna shook her head. "Because we refuse to die," Tay said simply. "That is our greatest power. Not our armor. Not our weapons. Just the simple, stubborn refusal to give up." The ship shuddered as it entered the planet's atmosphere. That night, Princess Vela came to see him. She arrived at his quarters without warning, accompanied by 2 guards who waited outside the door. She was dressed more simply than before, in a white gown that made her look almost ghostly. Tay was sitting on the floor, breathing slowly and deeply. He had removed his jacket. His chest was bare, covered with old scars from old wars. He did not stand when she entered. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preparing," he said. She walked closer, studying him with those silver eyes. "You are not afraid." It was not a question, but he answered anyway. "No, you should be." She crouched down to look at him more closely. "I have seen warriors from my own species, strong warriors. Born for the cold freeze to death on the path, they screamed as the ice took them. They begged for help that could not come. Their bodies turned to stone while their hearts still beat." She tilted her head. "And you sit here half naked, breathing like you are about to take a peaceful nap. Why?" Tay met her eyes. There was no anger in his face, no hatred, just calm acceptance. "Your species was built for ice," he said. "You never had to fight for survival. The cold was your friend from the beginning. But my species was not so lucky. We came from a world that tried to kill us every day. Predators that were faster and stronger. Diseases that could wipe out whole villages. Winters that lasted for years. We had no claws. No armor, no venom. We were small and weak and afraid." He stood up slowly. Even without his armor, he was shorter than her, weaker, slower. By every measure, he was inferior. "But we survived," he continued. "Not because we were strong, but because we refused to accept death. We learned to control our breathing. We learned to slow our heartbeats. We learned to push our bodies past every limit that nature set for us. This is what it means to be human. We are not made for anything. That is why we can endure everything." Vela stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, but it was a strange laugh. Without real humor. "You are either the bravest creature I have ever met," she said, "or the most foolish." "Maybe both," Tay replied. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Without looking back, she said, "I did not expect this, human. I expected you to beg, to make excuses, to run." She paused. "I am curious to see what happens tomorrow." The door closed behind her. Tay sat back down and closed his eyes. He thought about his grandmother, walking through the Korean snow with frozen feet and a burning will. He thought about his father, working 8-hour days in the mines until his back was bent and his hands were ruined. He thought about every human who had ever faced death and said no. Tomorrow, he would walk. The morning came too quickly. The sun rose over Kirith Prime, pale and distant, giving light but almost no warmth. Thousands of Kirith had gathered at the starting point of the frozen path. Cameras floated in the air, broadcasting 2 billions across the Empire. Tay stood at the edge of the ice. He wore only his thin thermal fatigues and his standard boots. His breath came out in white clouds that froze almost instantly. The cold was already biting at his exposed skin. Princess Vela stood nearby, watching him with an expression that was hard to read. 200 kilometers, an official announced. No assistance. No shelter. The human will walk until he reaches the end, or until he dies. Let the trial of endurance begin. Tay took his first step onto the ice. Behind him, the Kirith crowd fell silent. They had expected him to hesitate, to look back, to show some sign of the fear that all prey animals feel, but he just kept walking, his figure growing smaller and smaller against the endless white, and he did not look back. The first day was the worst. Not because of the cold, although the cold was terrible. Not because of the wind, although the wind cut through his thin clothes like 1,000 frozen knives. The first day was the worst because Tay had to teach his body to accept what was happening. Every cell in his body screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to find warmth. Evolution had built humans to avoid cold. Every instinct he had was telling him he was going to die. But Tay had learned long ago to ignore his instincts. He walked steadily, keeping a pace that would preserve his energy. He did not rush. Rushing would make him sweat, and sweat would freeze against his skin and steal whatever warmth remained. He breathed through his nose, warming the air before it entered his lungs. He kept his hands moving, flexing his fingers. Keeping the blood flowing above him, Kirith drones followed like silent vultures, broadcasting every moment to billions of viewers. The commentators spoke in amused tones. They expected this to be over quickly. Humans were soft creatures who needed heated rooms and warm clothes. This one would collapse within hours. By midday, Tay had covered 30 kilometers. The commentators stopped making jokes. The landscape around him was beautiful and deadly. White glaciers stretched to the horizon in every direction. The ice was ancient, older than human civilization, older than the Kirith Empire itself. Nothing lived here. Nothing could live here except the creatures that had evolved specifically for this hell. When the sun began to set, the temperature dropped even further. Tay felt the cold reaching deeper into his body, past his skin, past his muscles, into his bones. His fingers were numb. His face felt like it was made of wood. Every breath was painful. He stopped and looked around. He needed shelter. Without it, the night would kill him. The Kirith expected him to have nothing, no tools, no knowledge, no way to survive. But they had underestimated something important. They had underestimated 10,000 years of human survival. Tay found a snowdrift and began to dig. His hands were so cold that he could barely feel them, but he kept digging anyway. He used techniques that his ancestors had developed during the Ice Ages. Techniques that humans had used on Earth long before they had any technology at all. He carved out a small cave in the snow, just big enough for his body. The snow itself would act as insulation, trapping his body heat inside. He crawled into the shelter and curled into a ball. He pulled his arms inside his jacket, pressing them against his chest. He slowed his breathing even more, reducing the amount of heat his body was losing. It was not comfortable. It was barely survivable. But it was enough. In the broadcast stations across the Kirith Empire, millions of viewers watched in stunned silence. They had expected a frozen corpse by now. Instead, they saw a small figure huddled in a snow cave, still alive, still breathing. Princess Vila watched from her private quarters in the Imperial Palace. She had not moved from her screen since the trial began. She could not understand what she was seeing. This human had no fur, no blubber, no biological protection against the cold. He should be dead. The science was clear, and yet he was alive. How? She whispered to herself. How is this possible? The second day brought worse conditions. A storm rolled in from the north, covering everything in white. The wind screamed like a living thing. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The drones lost track of TE completely. The Kirith commentators declared him dead. There was no way any creature could survive such a storm, especially not a fragile human. They began preparing statements of condolence for the human delegation. But when the storm cleared 6 hours later, Tay was still walking. He had covered another 20 kilometers during the storm. He had done it by walking straight into the wind, using its direction as a compass. His face was raw and bleeding from the ice particles in the air. His lips were cracked so badly that blood froze in thin red lines down his chin. But he was alive. And he was still moving. On the third day, the wolves came. Kirith ice wolves were massive predators, the size of earth bears. With white fur and blue eyes and teeth designed to tear through frozen meat, they were used in the trial of endurance as a natural hazard. Even Kirith warriors sometimes fell to the wolf packs. Tay heard them before he saw them. The sound of their paws crunching on the ice came from behind him, getting closer. He turned and counted 5 of them, spreading out to surround him. He had no weapons, no armor, nothing but his bare hands and his frozen determination. The alpha wolf approached first, testing him. It was twice his size, a perfect killing machine evolved over millions of years. It lunged at him with jaws wide open. Tay moved. Not fast. His cold muscles could not move fast anymore, but smart. He stepped to the side at the last moment and brought his elbow down on the wolf's skull. It was not enough to kill it, but it stunned the animal long enough for Tay to grab a piece of ice from the ground. The ice broke into a sharp point in his hands. The wolf lunged again. This time, Tay drove the ice spike into its throat. The alpha collapsed. Blood steamed as it hit the frozen ground. The other wolves hesitated, then fled into the white wilderness. They understood something that their prey usually did not know how to teach them. This creature was dangerous. Tay stood over the dead wolf, breathing hard. His hands were shaking, partly from the cold and partly from adrenaline. He looked at the body for a long moment. Then he began to eat. The Kirith viewers watching the broadcast were horrified. This human was eating raw meat, tearing it from the bones with his bare teeth, swallowing it without hesitation. He was covered in blood, his eyes wild, his movements almost savage. "What are we witnessing?" one commentator asked, his voice shaking. "This is not the behavior of a civilized being. This is something else," Avella understood. The raw meat would give him calories. The blood would give him warmth. The human was not acting like an animal. He was acting like a survivor. He was doing whatever was necessary to stay alive. She found herself leaning closer to the screen, her heart beating faster. On the 4th night, Tay's body finally reached its limit. He had walked 150 kilometers in 4 days. His fingers were black with frostbite. His feet were swollen and bleeding inside his boots. His lips had cracked so many times that his entire mouth was covered in frozen blood. He could no longer feel most of his body. His thoughts were slow, confused, drifting. He fell face first into the snow. For several minutes he did not move. The drones circled overhead, recording what they assumed were the final moments of a dead man. Then Tay's hand moved. He pressed his palm into the snow. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He got to his knees. He breathed. He breathed again, and then he stood. He swayed on his feet, barely conscious, more dead than alive. But he was standing. And then, impossibly, he took another step, and another, and another dot in her quarters. Vila pressed her hand against the screen. Tears were forming in her silver eyes, though she did not understand why. Why? She whispered. Why will you not just die? But somewhere deep inside, she already knew the answer. This was what humans were. This was what they had always been. Not the strongest species. Not the fastest. Not the most adapted. Just the most stubborn, the most unwilling to accept the end. Tay kept walking. The finish line was still 50 kilometers away. His body was dying. His mind was fading. But his feet kept moving, one step at a time, into the endless white. He would not stop. He would never stop. That was the only truth that mattered now. By the 5th day, everything had changed. The broadcasts from the frozen path were no longer entertainment. They had become something sacred. Across the Kirith Empire, on 100 frozen worlds, millions of people had stopped their normal lives to watch a single human walk. They did not understand what they were seeing. It went against everything they believed. The Kirith had always known that they were the superior species. They were born for cold. They were made for endurance. Their bodies were perfect machines designed by millions of years of evolution. And here was this soft, fragile, warm-blooded creature doing something that should have been impossible. The commentators had stopped speaking hours ago. There was nothing left to say. The images spoke for themselves. A broken man, barely alive, walking across the ice one slow step at a time. His face was a frozen mask. His hands hung at his sides, black and dead. His clothes were torn and stained with blood from the wolf and from his own wounds. But his legs kept moving. His eyes stayed forward. He would not stop. Kirith citizens began gathering along the final stretch of the path. At first it was just a few curious observers, then dozens, then hundreds. By the time the sun rose on the 5th day, thousands of Kirith stood in the cold. Waiting to see the human finish, they did not cheer. They did not mock. They simply watched, their silver eyes filled with something that might have been wonder. Tay did not see them. His vision had narrowed to a single point directly in front of him. Everything else was blur and shadow. His thoughts had slowed to a crawl. He could no longer remember why he was walking. He could barely remember his own name. But his body kept moving, driven by something deeper than thought, deeper than memory, deeper than pain. He thought about his grandmother. Her face floated in the white fog of his mind, clear and sharp despite everything else fading. She had been a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with hands roughened by a lifetime of hard work. In the winter of 2087, when he was just a boy, the heating systems in Seoul had failed during the worst cold snap in a century. Half the city had frozen. People had died in their homes, waiting for help that never came. But his grandmother had not waited. She had wrapped herself in every blanket she could find and walked out into the snow. 30 kilometers to the emergency shelter. 30 kilometers through ice and wind and cold that could stop a heart in minutes. She had walked for 18 hours, and when she arrived, her feet were black and her face was blue, but she was alive. She had survived. Never stop, she had told him later when he was old enough to understand. No matter what happens, no matter how much it hurts, you keep walking until you reach the end. That is what our family does. That is what humans do. Tay held onto that memory like a torch in the darkness. He let it guide his feet when his mind could no longer do the job. In the imperial palace, Emperor Doran watched the broadcasts from his throne room. He was old, even by Kirith standards, his pale blue skin marked with the patterns of age. He had ruled for 300 years. He had seen wars and treaties, victories and defeats. He had met hundreds of species from across the galaxy, but he had never seen anything like this. Father. Princess Vela entered the throne room, her voice urgent. I am going to the finish line. The Emperor turned to look at his daughter. Her face was strange. The arrogance that had always defined her was gone, replaced by something softer, something more uncertain. Why? He asked. Because I need to see, she said. I need to understand. The Emperor nodded slowly. Go. And when it is over, come back and tell me what you learned. Vela flew to the finish line on a personal transport. She pushed through the crowd of Kirith observers until she stood at the very front, at the edge of the path. From there, she could see him in the distance, a small dark figure against the endless white. Moving so slowly that he seemed almost frozen, hours passed. The crowd grew larger. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind and the soft crunch of ice under the human's feet. Then, finally, he was close enough to see clearly. Vela felt her breath catch in her throat. He was a ruin. There was no other word for it. His skin was gray where it was not black with frostbite. His lips were gone, worn away by ice and cold until his teeth showed through. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, barely open, seeing nothing and everything at the same time. His clothes hung off his body in frozen rags. He walked like a dead man, his joints stiff, his movements mechanical, but he was still walking. One step, then another, then another. The finish line was a simple marker in the ice, nothing more than a pole with a flag. It was 30 meters away. Then 20. Then 10. Vela found herself moving forward, pushing past the boundary line, walking toward the human. The guards shouted at her to stop, but she ignored them. She needed to be there. She needed to see his face when he crossed. Tay's eyes found hers. For just a moment, there was recognition in them. He knew who she was. He remembered the insult, the challenge, the promise. He took another step. His legs buckled. He fell forward, crashing into the ice just meters from the finish line. A gasp went through the crowd. After all this, after everything he had endured, would he fail at the very end? Vela ran to him. She dropped to her knees beside his broken body, not caring about protocol, not caring about what anyone would think. Up close, he was even more horrible to look at. His skin was so cold that frost was forming on it. His breathing was shallow, barely there. "Get up," she said, her voice shaking. "Get up, human. You are almost there. You cannot stop now." Tay's hand moved. His fingers, black and frozen, pressed into the ice. He pushed. His arms trembled. His whole body shook with the effort. But slowly, impossibly, he rose. First to his knees, then to one foot, then to both feet. He swayed, nearly falling again. Vela reached out to steady him, but he shook his head. The movement was tiny, almost invisible, but the meaning was clear. He had to do this alone. He took one more step and crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted. Not in cheers exactly, but in something deeper, a sound of pure disbelief. Of wonder. Of something that might have been respect. Thousands of Kirith voices rose together, acknowledging what this human had done. Tay collapsed immediately after crossing. His body had given everything it had. There was nothing left. Vela knelt beside him again. His eyes were closed, but he was still breathing. Barely. She leaned close, her face inches from his. "Why?" she whispered. "You are not made for this. You are not built for cold. How did you survive?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then Tace cracked. Bleeding lips moved. His voice was a whisper, so quiet that only she could hear it. "We are not made for anything," he said. "That is why we survive everything." His eyes closed. His body went still. But his heart was still beating, refusing to stop, refusing to give up even now. The medical teams rushed in, lifting his frozen body onto a stretcher. Vela stood and watched them carry him away. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wet with tears she did not understand. Behind her, she heard movement. She turned and saw her father, Emperor Doran, approaching through the crowd. The Kirith observers parted before him like water before a ship. The Emperor stopped at the finish line. He looked at the blood on the ice, at the trail of footprints that stretched back 200 kilometers into the frozen wilderness. Then, slowly, the ruler of the Kirith Empire bowed. It was a small gesture, just a slight lowering of his head. But no emperor had ever bowed to an outsider before. In 10,000 years of Kirith history, it had never happened until now. "The treaty will be signed," the Emperor said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "The humans have earned their place among us. Otherwise." Vila watched the stretcher carrying Tay disappear into a medical transport. She did not know if he would live. His body was so damaged that survival seemed impossible. But she had learned something today. She had learned that impossible was just a word. And humans did not seem to care about words. They only cared about walking. 6. Months had passed since the trial of endurance. The galaxy was different now. The treaty between humanity and the Kirith Empire had been signed within days of Tay's walk. But it went further than anyone had expected. The Emperor had not simply granted trading rights. He had offered humanity a permanent seat on the Kirith High Council. An honor that had never been given to any alien species in 10,000 years of Kirith history. They have proven themselves, Emperor Doran had said during the ceremony. They have shown us something we did not know about strength. It would be foolish to treat them as anything less than equals. The human delegation had accepted with quiet dignity. They understood what this meant. It was not just a political victory. It was a recognition of something deeper, something that went beyond treaties and territories. The galaxy had seen a human walk through hell, and it had changed how everyone looked at the strange, soft creatures from Earth. Sergeant Han Tay had survived. The medical teams had worked for 3 weeks to save him. They had pumped warm blood into his frozen veins. They had regrown the skin on his face and hands. They had fought against the damage that the cold had done to his heart and lungs and brain. He had lost 3 fingers, 2 on his left hand, 1 on his right. The doctors had offered to replace them with biosynthetic prosthetics, perfect replicas that would work even better than the originals. Tay had refused. They are reminders, he said, of what I did, of what we can do. Now, he worked as a liaison officer at the New Earth Embassy on Kirith Prime. It was a quiet job. It's mostly paperwork and meetings, nothing like the violence of his military days. But he did not mind. He had done enough fighting for one lifetime. Now it was time to build something instead of destroying. Private Kim Yuna had stayed with him. She had been promoted to full medical officer and assigned to the embassy staff. Every morning, she checked on Tay's health, monitoring the lingering damage from his ordeal. Every morning, she found him already awake, already working, already refusing to slow down. You need to rest more, she told him one day, frowning at her medical scanner. Your heart is still recovering. Your lungs are still scarred. If you push yourself too hard, you could die? Tay smiled slightly. It was a strange expression on his scarred face, but it was genuine. I should have died 100 times out there, Yuna. Every day I have now is a gift. I am not going to waste it resting. She sighed but did not argue. She had learned by now that arguing with him was pointless. On a warm afternoon, warm by Kirith standards, which meant only 30 degrees below zero, a message arrived at the embassy. Princess Vela requested a private audience with the human soldier who had walked the frozen path. Tay agreed to meet her in the embassy garden. The garden was Yuna's idea. She had convinced the embassy architects to build a small enclosed space filled with earth plants, trees, and flowers and grass, all growing in real earth soil under artificial sunlight. It was a tiny piece of home on this frozen world, a reminder that life could thrive anywhere if given the chance. Vila arrived alone, without guards or attendants. She wore simple clothes, nothing like the glittering gowns she had worn at the diplomatic banquet. Her silver eyes were softer than Tay remembered, and there was something in her face that had not been there before. Uncertainty, perhaps, or humility. You look different, Tay said. So do you, she replied, looking at his scarred face, his missing fingers, the way he moved more slowly than before. Although I suppose that is my fault. No, he shook his head. It was my choice. I knew what I was doing. They walked through the garden together, following a small path that wound between the trees. Real birds sang in the branches above, brought from Earth to make the space feel more alive. Vila looked at everything with wide eyes, like a child seeing something magical for the first time. Ah! I have been thinking, she said eventually, about what you said. That night before the trial, you said your species was not made for anything, that you came from a world that tried to kill you every day. She stopped and turned to face him. I did not understand what you meant. I thought you were boasting, or perhaps lying. But now, I think I was wrong. Tay waited for her to continue. My people evolved for the cold, Vela said. We are perfect for our environment. Our bodies are designed for ice and wind and darkness. We look at ourselves and see strength, superiority, proof that we are the greatest species in the galaxy. No. She paused, her voice growing quieter. But now I wonder if we have it backwards. We never had to struggle. We never had to fight our own world. We simply existed, comfortable and safe, while you... She gestured at him, at the scars and the missing fingers and the quiet strength in his eyes. You fought every day just to survive? And that fight made you into something we could never become. Considered her words carefully. I do not think one species is better than another, he said finally. We are all just trying to survive. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. The important thing is not what we are born with. It is what we choose to do with it. Vila smiled slightly. That sounds like wisdom. It sounds like something my grandmother used to say. They continued walking. The artificial sun was beginning to set, painting the garden in shades of orange and gold. It looked nothing like Kirith Prime, nothing like the endless white emptiness of the frozen path. It looked like hope. I have a request, Vela said. It may seem strange, but I hope you will consider it. What is it? She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Her silver eyes were bright, almost eager. Teach me, she said. Teach me how to walk your path. Not the physical path. I do not need to freeze myself to prove anything. But the other path. The one inside you? The one that made you get up when any sane creature would have died? Tay studied her face. 6 months ago, she had been a spoiled princess who thought humans were nothing but soft animals hiding in metal shells. Now she stood before him, asking to learn from him. Asking to understand what it meant to be human. Why? He asked. Because I want to be more than what I was born to be, she said. I want to know what it feels like to refuse to give up. To keep walking when everything tells you to stop. She paused, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I want to be worthy of the respect you earned on that ice. For a long moment, Tay was silent. Then he reached out and picked a flower from a nearby bush, a small white bloom, simple and delicate, somehow surviving in this cold alien world. This flower was not made for Kirith Prime, he said, holding it up to catch the fading light. The soil is wrong. The temperature is wrong. The sunlight is artificial and weak. By every measure, this flower should not exist here. But someone decided to plant it anyway. Someone refused to accept that it could not survive. And now it grows. Not because the world changed to fit it, but because it found a way to fit the world. He handed the flower to Vila. She took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. That is what I can teach you, Tay said. Not how to walk in the cold. Not how to survive with a frozen body and a dying heart. But how to keep growing when everything around you says you should fail. How to find a way when there is no way. How to be more than what you were born to be. Vela looked at the flower in her hands. Tears were forming in her silver eyes, but she did not wipe them away. Will you teach me? She asked again. Tay smiled. It was the first real smile anyone had seen from him since before the trial knot. A polite expression. It's not a diplomatic gesture, but something warm and genuine and alive.